Yeah. Welcome to the Holocaust Centre today. I'm Sue Hampel, the co-president of the Holocaust Centre, and it is his absolute pleasure that I want to introduce you to the amazing Professor Deborah Lipstadt. Her CV is actually...
Thank you.
Her CV is very impressive. From TED Talks to the Krakow Cultural Festival, where I saw her last month, Deborah is a sought-after speaker as a historian of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. She is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University, Atlanta. She's best known for the libel lawsuit against her by David Irving for calling him a Holocaust denier. The trial judge found Irving to be a neo-Nazi polemicist who perverts history and engages in racist and anti-Semitic discourse. The Daily Telegraph described the trial as having done for the new century what the Nuremberg trials or the Eichmann trial did for earlier generations. Denials, starring Rachel Weisz, is based on Deborah's book History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier. Her most recent book is this one, which you can actually buy, and if Deborah's got time, she may sign it.
Good taste. Ready, have it?
And Antisemitism Here and Now. Deborah, we are honoured and delighted that you've taken time out of your very busy schedule to come to the Holocaust Centre to talk about responding to anti-Semitism in the museum setting.
I'm delighted to be here. We've gone back. I think this is my third visit to Melbourne, maybe my fourth. So you and I have interacted in many different contexts, including in Krakow.
Yes, and you were just in Sydney.
I was just in Sydney yesterday. Yeah, I came last night. Yeah.
And tell them about the Opera House.
I spoke at the Opera House, you know. Now that, how do you get to the Opera House, the Sydney Opera House? Practice. Or get invited to the Antidote Festival. It was very exciting. It was very nice. There was quite a crowd. And it was just a delightful and great interest in the book and great interest in the topic. No one is saying, why did you write this book? How come you wrote this book? Is it really necessary? That's one question I haven't encountered since the book came out. Sadly so.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good start actually to ask you about the book, because in that book you trace a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism since 2000, since the trial, and a particular uptake since 2016. And you say it comes from both the left and the right. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, I think it's very important to, and those of you who'll be there tonight will hear me say this, so you'll feel very smart. But we're seeing, and if you've read the book or heard me on the radio this morning, I've been saying this all along, that what we're seeing is really expression of anti-Semitism from both the right and the left. And it's not two different forms of anti-Semitism, it's the same anti-Semitism with the same stereotypes, the same memes, characteristics, whatever. Jews are rich, Jews are powerful, Jews are cunning, Jews are self-centered, and you hear it on the right and you hear it on the left. And one of the things that worries me and disturbs me is those on the right, political right, are very good to see it, keen on seeing it on the left, and those on the political left are very keen on seeing it on the right, but they don't see it standing right next to them. And I think that that's extremely important, that we see it amongst, that we recognize it and address it amongst those whose affinities we might share. Whose other political affinities we might share.
But why the rise? Why has it...
I don't know if there are more anti-Semites today. I think there probably are. But I think also the fact is that people feel emboldened. They feel free to say things that they didn't say before. They feel free to do things that they didn't do before. We see that not just with anti-Semitism, but with lots of other isms as well. But certainly that it is now more acceptable. And that, I think, in part comes from, the feeling that it's more acceptable, the feeling that it's okay, comes from certain political leaders, including my own country, who play on the divisiveness amongst groups, even if they're not talking about anti-Semitism, who play up violence, who play on populist themes. Now, yesterday in the Opera House, I was on this very interesting panel where we were discussing the difference between patriotism, nationalism, and populism. Patriotism is a love of country. It's a very powerful thing. It can be a very positive thing. You are loyal to the country and the people amongst whom you live. It's a certain affinity for where you live and the entity which you are part of. Nationalism can be as well, though nationalism, when it, to my mind, degenerates into my country, is always right, is never wrong. When it degenerates into a jingoism, as we would call it in the States, I don't know if you have that term here, then it's dangerous. But populism is a certain belief system where you get this dichotomy between elites. Against elites. We are the people and the elites are taking us wrong. The elites are misleading us. The elites are harming us. And it doesn't matter whether it's about your country's foreign policy, or it's about climate change, or it's about vaccines, that the people who know, the experts, are not only to be dismissed and ignored, but are to be seen as dangerous and antithetical to what you believe. And I think today in many parts of the world, the United States, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, United Kingdom, we see leaders who play on this populism, who play on this politics of resentment. And the politics of resentment need not necessarily be anti-Semitic, but more often than not, it's embedded with that same group that's looking for someone to blame. Who's behind all this? I'll give you an example. The continual focus on George Soros. Now, you may not like George Soros, you may not like his politics, you may not like his financial, actions and activities, etc. But this focus, Soros has sort of become the Rothschild of the 21st century. He is engineering this, he is behind all this. On some of these far right-wing websites, you see a picture of this monster-like dog, something J.K. Rowling might have imagined for a back room, a secret chamber in Hogwarts or something. And sometimes the face will be a Muslim face, someone with an hijab or a kafiyeh. Sometimes it will be a black face. Sometimes we'll have two faces. And riding on the back, directing this frightening beast is either someone with the face of George Soros, someone with the face of Netanyahu, someone with a Hasidic garb or something like that. That's what we saw in Charlottesville when they were marching and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." What did they mean by that? They meant that's part, and again, I'll talk about this tonight, of what's called white Christian replacement theory. That there is a plan afoot to replace, in Western democratic countries, European countries, this country, to replace the ruling structure of the society, which is white and Christian, with black people, with brown people, Muslims. But none of these black people, these brown people, these Muslims, says the advocates of white replacement theory, Christian replacement theory, they're not smart enough, they're not talented enough to do this on their own. They are being directed, they are being pushed by someone behind them, and that person is the Jew.
Yeah. The audience today is mainly people who work at our museum. So a couple of questions sort of related to that. Do you think, that there is a rise, as you were talking about, in online anti-Semitism. Can the museum be harnessed to help to combat this trend? Is there anything?
The online stuff is very big, and the idea that any one of us can sort of solve it is, I think, often, as we say in the South, whistling Dixie, a hopeless task. But I do think we have to be aware of it. I do think we have to be aware of what some of the young people who are coming see and how to address it. In my TED Talk, and you might look at it, just Google TED Talks plus Lipstadt, I begin by saying, for Holocaust deniers to be right, who has to be wrong? And certainly all the documents. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world, A. B, the survivors, who tell stories that buttress one another, not exactly the same, sometimes contradictory, but all those survivors would have been trained, programmed, and designed and placed to strategically tell the stories. The bystanders, the people who lived in the town of Treblinka, the town of Auschwitz, or who lived on the Eastern Front outside of cities where there were the mass shootings, who saw the Jews being marched off into the forest and saw the shots, or sometimes watched the shooting. All those people who've spoken to Father Patrick Dubois, whom I think you've hosted here, and others who saw, they would all have to be lying. All the historians, thousands of historians, would either have had to be fooled or be part of this story, would have to be part of this myth. Thousands of historians, American historians, French historians, Canadian historians, Israeli historians, German historians, Australian historians, would all, and most of all, the perpetrators. In no war crimes trial since the end of the war has a perpetrator ever stood up and said, or someone who's been accused of being a perpetrator, ever stood up and said it didn't happen. They said, I didn't do it. I wasn't responsible. I had no choice. But not that it didn't happen. So I think the way to to sort of expose this to the students is to show the fallacy in the reasoning. I'll give you another example. Sometimes deniers will say, oh, the Germans were so well organized and so successful in everything they did that they never would have allowed a group of Jews to survive, to tell the story. That the very fact that there are survivors makes no sense, so they must be lying. Because the Germans were so successful, they wouldn't have allow people who worked in the gas chambers to tell the story of what happened there. It doesn't make sense. So I pose this to my students, my university students, and I say, find the fallacy. And it doesn't take them long to get to the point with, what else did the Germans intend on doing that they might not have been successful at doing? Win the war. In other words, the fallacy is in the premise is based on a fallacy. So I think sometimes it instead of just saying, oh, that's anti-Semitism, or and sort of, but to sort of try to find the holes in the theory, there's no evidence. Where's the proof? Where's the evidence? How come no one ever said this till decades afterwards, when you have the people who weren't there saying it? And in my trial, all the different aspects of my trial, which shows that these arguments are not true.
Yeah, and related to that question, do you think that Holocaust museums are better placed in a way than other institutions to combat this denial, revisionism, because of our collection of artifacts and documents?
Yes, I think that certainly, instead of, again, just saying, oh, that's anti-Semitism, or you stupid idiot, or something like that, which we all want to say, but we sort of try to hold back from saying it. I think the documents, and the artifacts, let them speak for themselves. Now, that is one of the reasons why, in telling the story, we have to be so careful to get it right. I mean, we have to be careful to get it right in and of itself. If we had never heard of deniers, we would have to get the story right. The story is important enough, the victims are numerous enough, their treatment was horrific enough that we should be getting this right. But on top of that, because there is an assault on this, we have to get it just right. And not make certain glib statements or overarching statements, or and recognize that sometimes there were people who told stories about what happened that weren't entirely correct. Memory is a very, very tenuous thing. They sometimes misremembered, as a president of ours once said, or they not the current one. He remembers everything. And sometimes people adopted stories of other people because they wanted to tell those stories. I'm not in any way trying to cast doubt, but we have to be very careful. When historians, some of the more recent books on the history of the Shoah, Shaul Friedlander's The Years of Extermination, his book that won the Pulitzer Prize in History, it's an unbelievable book. It's a relationship, it's a big fat book. You really have to have a relationship with the book for a couple months to get through it. But he weaves together the facts with personal testimonies. Personal testimonies that he's been very careful to make sure the person got right. So the personal testimonies come to buttress the information. So I would say, look, this is what we have here in this document. Here we have the victim telling her story, and how do they come together, and how do they support one another? So I think that museums, because you have these artifacts, coupled with the personal stories, that you have a particularly powerful way of going about it.
Yeah, because you didn't use testimonies.
No, we didn't use testimonies.
Yeah.
We didn't use testimonies for a number of reasons in the trial. One, we didn't, survivors would have been witnesses of fact, not expert witnesses, just by legal parlance. You come and say, I saw this happening, I saw this accident happening, you're a witness of fact. If you're a scientist and said, well, look at the way the car tracks are and look at the way the skid marks are or something, the driver had to be going way above the speed limit, that's an expert witness. We did not want to suggest to the judge that we needed witnesses of fact to prove that David Irving was a liar. We didn't want to suggest, we didn't want, like happened in the Zundel trial in the late 80s in Canada, where the trial became about whether the Holocaust happened or not. We didn't want that to be the case. So instead of calling witnesses of fact, we wanted him to accept that the Holocaust is a given. We called expert witnesses, whose job it was to follow his footnotes back to the sources and prove the falsehood of what he was saying. But the other reasons we didn't want to call survivors as witnesses was that he was representing himself. He was a litigant in person, pro se, however you want to call it. And we didn't want to put an elderly person in the witness box to be cross-examined by someone whose objective we assumed it would be to humiliate them, to make fun of them, et cetera, et cetera. So those were the two reasons. We also didn't want to use recent testimony, because we didn't want to give him the chance to say, oh, that's just like the story in Schindler's List, or that. I mean, it may not have been. The person may be telling a genuine story, but so we did use witness testimony, but only testimony from the late 40s, that once after that, when this begins to be the public talk. One of the things we did, though, use, as I was just reminded at lunch today, Katja Altman.
Oh, Kitja, yeah.
Kitja, her famous encounter with,
That's right.
that's in the movie. That's in the movie, where Timothy Spall, playing David Irving, points at the picture of the number. Whether she was right or not, and I remember interacting with her when I was here, I think a couple of trips ago. Some people said it was right for her to do wrong. That's immaterial at this point. But by her interacting with him, she provoked him into saying one of the most shocking things, and that is, so unintended consequences. Lo lishma, ba lishma, as we say in Jewish tradition.
So I've got one more question for you, and then maybe the audience
Sure.
want to ask you.
Pleasure.
So we have a lot of students who come. We have over 22,000 students every year who come here.
Wow, that's great.
So yeah, and we're hoping to grow, and we're going to hopefully have double that amount next time you come. You'll visit our new museum. But what do you do, like if a student makes an anti-Semitic remark? I mean, how do you respond in the moment? We only have students for a short time. Do you call them out? How do you handle it?
No, I would love to say, you dolt. Where did you hear such a disgusting thing? Your parent must have heard it at home, Yeah, but I restrain myself. I can't give you a blanket answer. Each one is situational. And too often you think of the exact right thing to say at 1 o'clock in the morning, the night you wake up and say, I should have said that. But I think it's to show them often the absurdity of what they're saying, to show them the illogic of what they're saying. I have different examples. One example I have in the book is under what I call the clueless anti-Semite, because I have different kinds of anti-Semites. And a friend of mine who was in nursing school, and in this particular nursing school, Columbia, at that point in time, the way they did it, you were divided almost from day one into cohorts. And with that cohort, you were in class, you studied, that was your study group, that was your group when you went on to see patients and things like that. And my friend, who came from a very hospitable, wonderful, modern Orthodox family in New York, her cohort was all people from the Midwest, and in smaller towns, never really interacted with Jews. And towards the end of their time at the nursing school, right before graduation, they went out to eat for a luncheon, a celebratory luncheon, whatever, and she was the only Jew at the table. Now her family, because they were based in New York, would invite these women for Friday night dinner, would invite them for Purim parties, Pesach, for Hanukkah parties, whatever, very hospitable. And the young women loved it and loved being exposed to Jewish tradition, etc. And at the luncheon, they were talking about things they would miss in New York. Great bargains, great stores to have bargains. And one of them said, I just discovered this amazing store, classic store, Loman's. I don't know if any New Yorkers here, right? Okay, I get that. Doesn't exist anymore. And she turned to my friend, who was the only Jew at the table, and said, you're really going to be interested in this. And my friend, and this is her friend, this is a close friend who interacted with the family and appreciated being part of the family and that kind of thing, said, I didn't know Jews were the only ones smart enough to want to save their hard-earned money. And the young woman got it. So sometimes you have to, carpe diem, seize the moment, seize the day. It's very hard for me to give you a simple, all-encompassing explanation. But I think what you have to do, especially with young people, it's, as we say, as someone's saying in slang, suck it up for a minute, instead of like wanting to, as I say, say you dolt, where did you get that prejudicial, horrible idea that led to the Holocaust, but to try to expose the fallacy in the students' thinking, to expose the wrong in the students' thinking, to expose the mistakes or the acceptance of certain prejudicial ideas. So.
Okay, over to the audience. Anyone like to ask Deborah?
I'd like your opinion on this, Deborah. My father, who was a survivor of both Hitler and Stalin, and this is to do with the extreme left and the extreme right being anti-Semitic, said that most people think the political spectrum is a straight line, with the extreme left on one side, the extreme right on the other. They're wrong, it's a clock face, and they meet at 12 o'clock. And the only difference between a Stalinist communist and a Hitler right Nazi is that they're both exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that's true, because I see them meeting in the middle. I do have to say, and I'm no fan of Stalin's, clearly not, but that as horrific as he was, his objective was not to wipe out every Jew. There's a difference. There is a difference. And I think we gloss over his historical differences and certain unique aspects of the Holocaust if we do that. It's not a defense of Stalin, it's a condemnation of the Germans. So I think there is a difference. On his statement that right and the left meet at the same place, absolutely.
Fantastic book.
Thank you.
I'm only 50 pages in, but already I've got a
You like the jokes?
I do. I recommend it to everybody. You have to buy it as a...
I was interviewed by Ramona Koval, who's a local,
Yeah.
yesterday at the Opera House, and she told me that in the first 25 pages there are already 3 jokes.
It's true. It's true. You'll love it. You have to buy it, especially for all of us guides. What really, this isn't quite a museum question, but it is a very important question. You say right in the beginning that it's almost axiomatic that if a society is anti-Semitic, it will hate other minority groups. Can you expand on that,
Sure.
please?
Anti-Semitism is a prejudice. like other prejudices. Think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. I've made up my mind. Don't confuse me with the facts. So if you're inclined to hate Jews, you're going to be inclined to hate others because Jews are other. I think your hatred of the Jew will often be different because you see the Jew, as opposed to racists seeing people of color as lesser than, you see the Jew is more powerful. The Jew is scarier. The Jew is more prone to do evil as opposed to just, degrade your gene pool or something like that. But I think that once you hate one other, you're going to hate others. And I think sometimes we Jews delude ourselves today, especially today, some groups, and say, well, they're not really against Jews, so it's okay. I believe very strongly you can't fight one ism without fighting other isms. And you can't engage in isms to fight an ism. So in other words, on both sides, you have people who engage in anti-Semitism to degrade Jews, people on the left who would say, oh, well, I'm not, or to criticize Israel, which is okay, but do it in a way that they do it in a way that's anti-Semitic, or Jews who hate anti-Semitism, despise anti-Semitism, but engage in racism, even when they use it in a Yiddish term. It's racism. It's not a color, it's a racist term.
I also like to endorse the book like Mary and think it's a must-read for all the guides here today. I've already introduced myself. I think one of our huge problems we face here when we have students coming through our education program is that they've almost absorbed the Nazi anti-Semitism because of poor teaching. And so that they've actually, we actually identified this a couple of years ago. One of our education officers, Fiona Kelman, actually brought this to our attention, that they've actually absorbed that view of the Jew through the propaganda. And I suppose I'd like you to comment about education, not that you necessarily can comment about what's done here in Victoria, but how the Holocaust is taught in schools and maybe ways to sort of tackle that as well. Thank you.
I think often it's taught very poorly, and you probably have encountered that. Let me, instead of doing a critique of how it's taught, let me talk about some of the things that I think are important to recognize. First of all, I stress in my history of the Holocaust class the step-by-step nature. That it didn't happen, they didn't decide on February 1, 1933, okay, we're going to kill the Jews. But it was a step-by-step nature. How far can we push things? And they start, even your question, I think was your question, they start with other groups first, socialists, communists, etc. But there is a step-by-step nature, A. B, they don't begin with actions, they begin with words. And no genocide, not the Holocaust, not Rwanda, not former Yugoslavia, not Armenia, ever began with actions. It always began with words, by demonizing the people who engage in that. So I think that those are very important elements. It doesn't mean that someone who on the schoolyard uses a terrible word against someone is ipso facto going to become a genocideer, a committer of genocide. But every genocideer began with words. So I think that would be another way. I think, another important aspect, less so about the anti-Semitism, is the notion that these Jews were just not smart enough, they didn't see it coming, etc. One of the books I would recommend in this regard is Marion Kaplan's Between Dignity and Despair. I think you and I have talked about that in years past. It's a magnificent book, and it makes it very clear that every Jew in Germany wanted to get out. Some wanted to get out in 1933, some waited until after Kristallnacht, whatever it might be, but most of them didn't either have the means. It was expensive, it was difficult. If you were older in your 40s, if you were established, it was hard. So that it's not that we're so smart. Another point I stress, and this doesn't go much to the anti-Semitism, but in terms of, that certainly with Jewish kids, when we get to the resistance, that's where I would have been. It's that this was an overwhelming force to rise up against. This was a very difficult thing, and yet there was resistance. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the first armed resistance against the Germans anywhere in Europe. Not Jewish, anywhere. You know, and that happens in April 43. The Polish uprising is in August 44. It's a big difference. So I think that would be another aspect that I would stress. And I would also stress the anti-Semitism, here it does touch on the anti-Semitism, but that the world didn't want these people. How hard, you know, none is too many in Canada and America turning back to St. Louis and other things, that these people weren't wanted. They didn't want them. So those are the kind of things that I would but the incremental nature of it, I think, is very important. That you test. You test how far can I go. You know, you start by firing the lawyers and the judges. And then you go a little bit further, and then the teachers, and then you take away citizenship, and you just keep testing. You know, it's sort of like, not that I've had much experience or any experience in this, but cooking the lobster. You know, you keep hiding. If you've had experience, you don't have to admit it.
Thanks, Deborah. Just wanted to ask, in terms of your views on the viability of an almost offense type attack of anti-Semitism instead of just purely the defensive side. So what often happens is, you know, we're here, we detect a viewpoint in a student, and I know a lot of the times we look at each other going, well, that's clearly come from something said at home or something like that. So likewise, my kids playing Jewish football team, and it's quite regular, they hear things out there, and it's always the same sort of view. This must have come from home. This hasn't come from, you know, the education of the teachers in this case. So, you know, sometimes I'm wondering whether we're trying to re-educate the right people in isolation, or whether there's something else that we could be doing to actually sort of re-educate the source of some of these views.
No, I think you're right. It comes from somewhere else, and sometimes it comes from home, sometimes it comes from other kids. But there was an incident in a Washington, D.C. middle school, so 7th, 8th grade, like 11, 12, something like that, maybe a little bit younger, earlier this year, where it happened to be a school with a lot of both blacks and whites. Some of the D.C. schools are mainly African Americans. And a white kid was playing football with a number of African American kids, and he used the N-word. And they looked at him, and he said, well, you can call me racist, but I don't care. That comes from home. You hear that? That's, you know, that's not a kid, you know. That's the attitude that was, you know, that part of when I was talking about the rise that we're seeing today. So, of course, you'd want to get to the parents. But you've only got the kid in front of you. So I think it's again, it's a hard thing, because you don't want to say, oh, your father's a racist and an anti-Semite, and because the kid is, it's a very tough thing to do. You might be frustrated by the fact that I'm not giving you automatic answers, but there aren't. Anybody who comes to, you hear the 10 things you should do kind of thing, don't bother. But I think you're right. Sometimes it comes from home, but sometimes it'll come from other kids and things like that.
So we've got about 5 minutes. Deborah has to go.
Hello, thank you. Maybe this is another similar kind of question then you can't easily respond to. But when you get kids in the museum who are saying, you know, you as in Jews, Israelis, are doing this to the Palestinians, right. How do you respond? Because this is my one in the morning.
Yeah, that's a very common thing, because that's out there a lot. My argument, and this is hard to do again with a group of kids, but you've got to figure out the way in, is that, you know, there can be things you disagree with, and things that policies that we don't like, etc. But this is not an effort to annihilate another people. In the, you know, the fact that you're seeing the growth of population. It doesn't mean you're defending all of Israel's policies, some of which I think are right to be criticized. But the analogy to the Nazis, and again, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle and telling an audience like this, is just wrong. And you've got to sort of get into how it's wrong, but the very fact of that flip is, or that accusation, that inversion of victim and perpetrator is part of some of the soft-core denial that we see. So I would say, look, this is not, there may be things we disagree with, there may be even things we would consider human rights abuses, but there's no attempt to annihilate a population. This is not an attempt to go after everyone, living in every part of the world. Things can be bad, things can be wrong without being a Holocaust, without being that kind of inversion. And I've written, there's some of this in the book as well, and there's a lot of it on the internet as well. But it's an important thing, because that is something that I'm sure is quite common. Okay, got one more?
Yep.
Okay.
I would like to go back to the question of the right and the left, both hating others, the other. Now, on the left, and we see it here in Australia, there is plenty of anti-Semitism, and even Jews who might be called anti-Semitic. But at the same time, the left purports to support all the people of colour, all the people of, different ethnic groups. How do we equate that? How is it that they are anti-Semitic?
Okay, I'm going to talk more about this tonight, so I don't want to steal my own thunder. But basically, on what we see on the progressive left, not everyone, but certainly some on the progressive left, we see a view of the Jew as a white person, even though on the right, they don't see the people in Charlottesville and the people in Pittsburgh didn't see the Jews as white. And they see the Jews as privileged, wealthy. And if you're white and you're privileged and you have power, ipso facto, you can't be a victim. So any claim you have of victimhood, you're making it up to attack the party, and if it's the Labour Party, to defend Israel, whatever it is. It's the only case where the left the default isn't I'll believe the victim, but the default is I don't believe the victim. And we see that very much with Corbyn's Labour Party, that anybody bringing it must have an ulterior motive. They can't be believed, and that's part of it. Okay,
Deborah, I wish, and Henry's a child survivor. Can you just, last quick question.
I haven't read your book, but I'm just wondering whether... Yet. Good. But I'm just wondering whether you knew that Australia, obviously you'd know that we had the White Australia policy, and during the period of 1948, there was a quota system, and in fact they did not allow any Jews into Australia. And in fact, I came to Australia as a Catholic. I had to get permission, and it was very interesting. And one of the founders of the early Labor Party members was Caldwell, and he originally accepted that. Then later on, he wisened up about the fact that Jews should come to Australia because they needed brainy people who can help.
So is there a question?
Well, it's partly a question. Did you have that in your...
I don't deal as much with the history. I'm dealing with the contemporary. But clearly, if the world was divided into groups that didn't, at that time, and even after the war, that didn't want any more Jews or didn't want any Jews, and Australia was one of them, Canada, my country, the United States. This notion that anyone could go anywhere or things like that is quite distressing, because we know it's not true. And sometimes it changed for what we call philo-Semitic reasons, which are almost anti-Semitic. We need to develop our banking system. Well, we need, it's almost like the Japanese. One of the reasons, the Fugu plan, Fugu plan. It's been a long day. Was we need people to help it make us rich. So, but that's part of the history. That's a very important part of the history. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, Deborah, thank you. We would love you to be here for hours and hours, but hopefully you can come tonight and tomorrow night. Deborah's speaking. We've been entertained, we've been enlightened, and we've been educated. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.